public concerning proper personal health care and methods for effective use of available health services. Well, there's a list of priorities that will keep those agencies busy and will also point the way to the future. Finally, what does all of this mean for the individual? Let's save that for last. That's what does it all mean for you and for me? How should we respond to new definitions of health and new conceptualizations of health services? Where do we fit in to the transitional period in health and health services? Well, the fact is that yours is the key role, which you can play at a variety of levels if you've got the energy and interest. First and foremost, you can recognize that you are in charge of your own health, that you cannot delegate that responsibility without great personal risk, and that how you carry out that responsibility can make a great deal of difference. This is a very large subject. I can only touch on it here lightly. Let me mention just one point that I consider to be, at the same time, probably the most exciting and dullest medical discovery of the century. I wonder how something could be described that way. Well, I'm referring to some studies that have shown that life expectancy and health are significantly related to the following basic health habits. And I'm going to list 7. First, 3 meals a day at regular times and no snacking. Second, breakfast every day. Third, exercise at least 2 or 3 times a week. Fourth, adequate sleep. Fifth, no smoking. No smoking. Sixth, moderate weight. 7, no alcohol or only in moderation. Those are the 7. Now, studies have shown, and I didn't make this up, studies have shown that a 45-year-old man, any 45-year-old men here? A 45-year-old man who practices 3 or fewer of those 7 habits has an average life expectancy of 22 years. That is, he'll get to be 67 and then out. While one who practices 6 or 7 of the 7 of these habits has an average life expectancy of 33 years. He'll go to 78. In other words, the chances are that you can add 11 years to your life by relatively simple changes in habits of living. Now, other examples could be given illustrating that what your mother tried to tell you when you were a kid is probably more important to you than most of the billions of dollars this nation is investing in hospitals and doctors and personal health services. Your heredity and environment and lifestyle and health habits are much more important factors in terms of your health than the whole personal health services establishment, at least on the average. Now, of course, in a life-threatening acute emergency, the situation is quite revised. But generally, your body has great capacity for staying well and for getting better on its own if you only cooperate and give it a little help. Now, you can't do that much about your heredity, but you really can do a lot about your lifestyle, about your environment, about your health habits. There's been a number of studies. I could go into detailed ones. The most recent one is a study they did up in Finland. You know about that one with the heart attacks? There was this section of Finland where the men around the age of 45 to 50 were dropping off like flies. And they went in and made studies of the men's diet and their smoking habits. And inside, these men were all very physically active and so forth, but they encouraged some fundamental changes in health habits, and they have really brought that death rate down to where it's just about average now for Finland. Well, There's a lot you can do along that line. Now, beyond that, you can decide to learn more about your body and about basic medical care, and learn to provide effective self-care for many disorders. You know, one of the real keys in health services, as you all know, is tender, loving care. Well, who can give you tender, loving care better than you? You know? Maybe your wife or husband, but you know, you really love yourself. If you don't, that's a problem too. But won't go into that. I have a great deal of conviction that the best tender, loving care can be rendered by oneself. As costs of healthcare services rise, investment in self-care knowledge becomes cost-effective. It becomes less personal bother, and even possibly more fun, and a lot less dangerous, because hospitals are getting to be somewhat dangerous places. Beyond that, you can go further. You really should find, if you don't have one now, a primary care physician who will be interested in helping you and your family to stay healthy, and who will be interested in protecting your health with least effort on his part. And you should insist on a physician who respects your body, who respects you and your family, who associates himself with a medical group, formal or informal, which stresses primary care as the key to effective use of secondary and tertiary services, and who associates himself with a hospital that stresses primary care as the key to effective use of secondary and tertiary services. A physician who makes maximum use of allied health personnel in a team approach to helping you with your health. Ideally, your primary care physician might be associated with a medical group or hospital which makes provision for consumer input in policy formulation at the level of the board of directors or advisory council level. This will enable you, if you so desire, to play a key role in making sure that not only your own physician, but the larger health organization is sensitive to new approaches to health and health services. Finally, of course, if you still have time and energy, there's more you can do. You can associate yourself with your local Blue Cross or Blue Shield plan and your local health systems agency and try to have impact on the total health care system. You can do all of these things, or just some, but your initiative could be very important. The system will respond to consumer demands. Furthermore, professional initiatives for new approaches to health are bound to be limited in the absence of evidence of consumer support. You can't wait for the physicians to take all the leadership. We face an extremely difficult and long-term transition, and you can play a key role in your own community, which is where the action is. Healthcare, whatever happens in Washington, is still essentially a community affair. Possibly getting interested in this kind of thing can be a lot of fun for you if you take the long view. And through this effort, you can very well save a lot of lives and save a lot of money. Because I think we can save lives and money both. And one of the lives you could save might even be your own. Thank you.
That was Robert Sigmund, Special Advisor on Hospital Affairs for the Blue Cross Association in Chicago, and formerly Executive Vice President of the Albert Einstein Medical Center in Philadelphia, speaking on the topic, America, 11 Years After Medicare, the Problems Confronting Society in Healthcare Delivery and Financing. The lecture was taped at Iowa State University on September 20th, 1977, during a symposium on America's health and the human condition. Rostrum is a public affairs presentation, and today's program came to you from Ames. We now pause 10 seconds for station identification. This is Iowa Public Radio.
Your World, and from the BBC in London, this is Michael Butler. The world's fishing fleets are, it seems, threatening to fish whole species out of existence. In the past, they've decimated herring stocks around Japan and Iceland, anchovy off Peru, haddock off the United States, squid off Mauritania, and pilchard off Namibia. And they've severely overfished many other species, like cod and tuna from the big fisheries in the Atlantic and Pacific. The usual response of coastal nations where fish stocks are under threat is to declare a 200-mile limit. But is this enough? Does it in fact conserve stocks, or merely reserve their overfishing for a few lucky countries? With me to look at the problem are Tony Loftus, the editor of the journal Marine Policy, and Dr. John Godfrey of Edinburgh University, a zoologist who studies fish population biology. I'd like to start, Tony Loftus, by asking you how serious you think the threat to world fisheries really is. Is there cause for alarm?
Well, I think there's certainly cause for alarm. I don't think it's too late to do something about the matter, though. The fish catch of the world has stayed more or less static over the past few years. Sometimes it goes up a few million tons, sometimes down a few million tons. Certainly most of the major commercial fish species are fully exploited or overexploited.
Dr. Godfrey, which areas of the world do you think are particularly threatened? Can you point to one or two areas and say these are worse off than others?
I think that the areas which are richest in fish are mainly overexploited already. Probably about 100 million tons or so of fish could be caught worldwide as a maximum which could be allowed in the future. And already we're taking 3/4 of that. So it is a worldwide problem.
You see, I was wondering whether it is possible to point to any part of the world and say there is a fish famine. When people talk about overfishing and fish disappearing, what effect would it actually be having?
Removing fish doesn't create famine. What it does is impoverish the diet, so which is not quite the same thing. For example, in Lake Victoria, where a particular species of fish was more or less being wiped out by simple changes in the fishing technology, changes which prevented the adult fish from reaching their spawning grounds. So within a period of literally of 3 or 4 years, that fishery disappeared. Now, if you walk into the markets in the local villages, you'll no longer see the smoked fish, which was a very popular part of the diet. Now, I saw no evidence when I was there that people were dying from, there was a famine of fish. Other kinds of varieties were being used, but it certainly shows that that fish has disappeared from their diet, and the people regret it. There's no doubt about that.
To what would you attribute, really, the rise of fishing? We've always had fishing, but now suddenly we hear in the last 10, 20 years that there is overfishing. Is it, first of all, a matter of the technology, the fact that now we have factory ships? John Godfrey?
The main improvements have been technological. It's now possible, using radar, to know where the fish are. You don't just cast your nets into the waters and hope to catch fish. You cast your nets around a shoal of fish, and then you pull out that shoal of fish. It's as easy as that, once you've got the right technology and the right nets for doing it. But that means that you can actually fish out fish stocks, rather than merely taking a proportion of the fish stock.
But surely behind this technology there lies a demand, an increased demand of that sort.
One of the problems is that some countries, for various reasons, some ideological reasons, have invested tremendously in modern ships. Now, modern ships, it takes some time to pay those vessels off. And if, for example, they find a shortage of fish in one area, they move to another area. Well, this hasn't mattered until quite recently, when more and more countries have wished to join in this world fishery. So we've got this paradox now where countries have built very large, modern, sophisticated vessels capable of touring the world, if you like, in search of fish. And at the same time, the actual productivity of those vessels has gone down when compared with the capital cost of building them and the number of people required to operate them.
So what is to be done about it? The thing that everybody, I think, has read about in recent years is the resort of nations to the 200-mile limit. Is this, you think, a reasonable kind of precaution to take, John Godfrey?
Overexploitation is due to the fact that it doesn't pay anybody in the fishing business to hold back from taking fish from a common stock. And if the stock belongs to one country because it's within their 200-mile exclusive economic zone, then they have the power to have laws to control the fishery. And that is the only way that it can be done. Agreements between countries where each country can set as low a limit as it wants to, or as high a limit as it wants to, don't in practice work. So I think that the 200-mile limits are a prerequisite for a good solution, but they're not sufficient. You've still got to have the right policies within the 200-mile limits of a given country.
Yes, I'd like to support that, because you have to bear in mind that the fish are not aware of the 200-mile limit. Now, there are some countries, Iceland I would suspect is one, where most of the major stocks can be reasonably considered to be contained within the 200-mile zone around the island. That's not all stocks, because we know that some do move out of those waters. But if you move, say, to West Africa and look along the West African coast, there are stocks which certainly migrate both out to sea beyond 200 miles and also along the coast into neighbouring zones. Now, quite clearly, the imposition of a control in one country, the choice of wise fishing gears, sensible offtakes, are going to be irrelevant if the neighbouring country isn't practising the same kind of rules and regulations.
There are some coastal states which haven't yet declared a 200-mile limit, and you will find off the coast of some of them the long-distance freezer trawlers of industrialised nations taking great advantage of this. And my advice to any third world country which hasn't declared a 200-mile limit is to do so straight away, and even if they're not capable at the moment of exploiting their own fishery, to sell licenses so that they can get some capital in to do their own fishery development.
Apart from limits, do you think the loss of fish can be compensated for by, say, going for other types of fish or going into deeper waters for fish, or is this already being fairly actively pursued?
It's surprising that the oceans of the world, as opposed to the coastal seas, are remarkably unproductive. And this is because the nutrients in the surface waters get used up by the plants living in them, and so there is no capacity for further growth unless the waters get stirred, as they do off the west coast of the southern continents, where you have, off Peru for instance, a huge anchoveta fishery, which depends upon the upwelling of water deep in the ocean, which has got the nutrients which are normally a limiting factor for plant growth.
Is there any likelihood of, say, going lower down the food chain and getting krill, for example, which might make a fish substitute?
Well, there have been several expeditions to the Antarctic waters in search of krill. I think there's a consensus growing now that it's not difficult to catch krill. Initially, there were great problems because it used to clog the nets, and you also need very powerful boats to tow these very large wide open nets. There is still a slight problem with processing, and that is, how do you make krill attractive? The Russians market a form of krill paste, which is said to be attractive. I had a little nibble at it and didn't like it very much at all. The Japanese also produce a similar kind of product, and it's rumoured that in Chile krill is being processed. But at the moment there's a great political debate on this, because no one is really sure who should own the krill, and certainly who should regulate the fishery.
John Godfrey, looking to another possible source, what about fish farming?
I think there's a very limited future, but an important future locally for fish farming. If you farm sea fish, you have to keep them in a container, and that container is very expensive, and therefore I don't think one can do fish farming for sea fish except for the most expensive and most desired sorts of fish, really luxury items.
It looks as though over the last few minutes we've been really rather talking about some desperate resorts. This seems to strengthen the case for international agreements of some kind, and it seems to come down to a question of limiting quotas or limiting effort. Now, to Ternodoftis, what would you say about that? Do you think that either method could be effective, or possibly both?
Well, both methods have been tried rather unsuccessfully so far. The problem here is to persuade countries, where you've got several countries joining in a fishery, to control their demands. The whole history of fisheries regulation, certainly since the late 50s, has been one of scientists giving, on the whole, reasonable advice as to what should be caught, and national commissioners deciding against this. For example, it has not been unusual for the national commissioners together in a meeting to fix a total catch a quarter, 25% more than the scientists recommend as being a reasonable level of exploitation. I mean, and so we're talking still, as always, about the political will of people.
John Godfrey?
Yes, I think that there's a great deal to be said for trying to control the amount of fishing done rather than the amount of fish caught. This can be done by licensing boats within the 200-mile zone of a given country, so that only a limited number of boats can fish for a limited period. Controlling fishing effort reduces the costs to the industry, which means that there's more money available for either wages to the fishermen, or improving the welfare of the fishermen, or lowering the costs of the fish to the consumer. Reducing effort also has a self-regulating effect on the fish stocks, because any sort of quota will depend upon an estimate of how many fish will be there to be caught, and people will always make errors in their estimate. If there are fewer fish than you'd expected, then for a given amount of fishing effort, you will actually catch fewer fish. Whereas if you set a quota of a tonnage of fish which are to be allowed to be caught, that tonnage will be caught irrespective, and that will lead to overfishing. And the third reason for preferring effort limitation is that it's easier to enforce, because you only have to have evidence of who is present in a particular place and whether or not he's got a license to do that, rather than having to inspect what he's done when he's in his own port.
But presumably all this will depend upon a high degree of international agreement. I'd finally like to ask you both to look into the future a little and say whether, first of all, you see continuing political problems and also, of course, continuing efforts to reach agreements as against the possible extinction of certain species of fish. Is this likely? Tony Loftus.
I don't think we'll ever see extinction of species. What we will see is a progressive collapse of various fishing industries. Obviously, the efforts to try and arrive at a sensible solution will continue. Clearly, the 200-mile zones could help, providing those countries that the coastal states that enjoy those zones are prepared to look beyond their own coastlines, because we still don't really know enough about the oceans. We don't know enough about the interaction of different parts of the sea. We don't even know very much about areas where there are many different species of fish being caught at the same time. Traditionally, most of our knowledge has come from the northern areas, where we've been talking about one or two species being caught. In the tropical and subtropical areas, you can get sort of 42 or 50 different species in a single catch. Now, that's a different management problem altogether.
John Godfrey.
I'm very hopeful for the future, because we do have a new legal regime which allows the control of fishery, and we also have a much wider public acceptance of the need for conservation. And that public acceptance will put pressure on politicians to reach decisions. My one worry about the 200-mile scheme is that what was a common international property, therefore available to people from countries which don't have a large coast, is no longer available to them. And I think that third world countries who don't have a large coast have had a lot taken from them, and I think they need to be compensated.
John Godfrey, Tony Loftus, thank you very much. You've been listening to Your World. This is Michael Butler, BBC, London.
This program was made possible with funds provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This is NPR, National Public Radio.